July 1187. The gates of Jerusalem are about to fall. 88 years of Christian rule are ending in a single afternoon, and the man holding the sword is not swinging it. He is standing completely still, watching an entire city hold its breath, waiting for him to do what every conqueror in history has done. And he is about to break every single rule of war that the world has ever known. But here is where it gets impossible. Because the last time these same gates opened for a conquering army, what walked through them was not justice. It was not mercy. It was a slaughter so complete, so grotesque, so drenched in blood that historians still struggle to describe it without looking away. And the man standing outside those gates in 1187, the man the entire Christian world called a monster, already knew exactly what had happened inside that city 88 years before. He knew what the Crusaders did. He knew every detail. And if that sounds insane, if it sounds impossible that a man who knew all of that would still choose to open those gates and let the people walk free, then stay with me, because this is the most extraordinary story of mercy, vengeance, and broken human nature that history has ever recorded. And it only gets darker before it gets extraordinary. To understand what Saladin did in 1187, you have to go back to 1099, because without that year, nothing that follows makes any sense at all. The First Crusade was not a military campaign. It was a religious apocalypse wearing armor. Hundreds of thousands of European soldiers, monks, peasants, and zealots had marched across an entire continent through deserts and mountains and starvation, driven by one single belief that God himself had commanded them to seize the Holy Land and hold it with their lives. They had already massacred Jewish communities across Europe on their way. They had already shown the world what their faith looked like in motion. And now, after nearly 3 years of marching, fighting, and dying, they stood outside the walls of Jerusalem on June 15th, 1099. The city was one of the most fortified positions on earth. It had walls that had stopped armies for centuries. But the Crusaders did not stop. They built siege towers. They prayed. They waited. And on July 15th, 1099, they broke through. What happened next is one of the most documented atrocities in medieval history, and the documentation itself is the most horrifying part, because the people who recorded it were not enemies of the crusade. They were the Crusaders themselves. Their own chroniclers, men who believed with absolute certainty that they were doing God's will, wrote down what they did with something that reads less like horror and more like pride. The streets of Jerusalem ran with blood so deep that the accounts describe soldiers wading through it up to their ankles. Muslim men, women, and children were killed in the mosques where they had taken sanctuary. Jews who had fled into their synagogues were locked inside and burned alive. The Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in Islam, was ransacked. Bodies were piled in the streets for days. The estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to over 70,000, and no one will ever know the true number because there was no one left to count them. The Crusaders called it a miracle. They called it the will of God made flesh. Pope Urban II, the man who had called the crusade, had promised that any soldier who participated would have his sins forgiven. And so they celebrated. They prayed over the bodies. They thanked heaven. And then they built an entire kingdom on top of the dead. Now move the clock forward. 88 years. The year is 1187. Jerusalem is still in Crusader hands, and it has been for the entire lifetime of everyone alive in it. The city has been Christian for so long that an entire generation has grown up believing it was always meant to be that way. But the man coming to take it back is Saladin, and the world that the Crusaders have built their mythology around is about to crack open. Saladin was not a mystery. He was not a shadow or a rumor. He was a deeply strategic, deeply intelligent Sultan of Egypt and Syria who had spent years rebuilding the Muslim world after it had been shattered by the Crusades. He was also, by every account left by both friend and enemy, a man of extraordinary personal honor. His enemies respected him. His allies sometimes feared him not because he was cruel, but because he was relentless. And in the summer of 1187, he was relentless in the most efficient way possible. At the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, he destroyed the entire Crusader army in a single engagement. It was not a close fight, it was a collapse. The Crusader king of Jerusalem was captured, the armies were broken, and suddenly, for the first time in nearly a century, Jerusalem had no military force standing between it and Saladin. The city knew what was coming. Every person inside those walls understood exactly what conquering armies did to conquered cities. They had inherited that knowledge. It was written in their own histories. The Muslim population of Jerusalem, what remained of it, understood it even more intimately because their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived through the version of this story that ended in mass slaughter. The negotiations began. Jerusalem's defenders sent envoys to Saladin asking for terms. The tension was unbearable. The city was waiting for the sword. And then Saladin offered them terms that made no sense at all. Every Christian inhabitant of Jerusalem could leave. They could walk out of the city with their lives. They would be given safe passage. They could carry their belongings. Families would not be separated. The ransom demands were remarkably low, and when it became clear that some of the poorest residents could not even afford those modest demands, Saladin released thousands of them for free. Entire families walked out of the gates of Jerusalem alive, escorted by Saladin's own soldiers to ensure no one harmed them on the road. No massacre, no retribution, no blood in the streets, no burning synagogues or mosques. No bodies piled for days. Nothing. The city that had been soaked in Muslim blood 88 years before was handed over with a formality that historians have spent centuries trying to explain. And this is where the story stops being comfortable, because the easiest version of this moment is the one that turns Saladin into a saint and the Crusaders into demons. But Saladin was not a saint. He was a conqueror. He executed prisoners of war after Hattin. He was ruthless in battle. He understood power, and he used it without hesitation. What he chose in Jerusalem was not weakness. It was something far more dangerous. It was a calculation so deep and so cold that it terrified his own generals. Because Saladin understood something that the Crusaders in 1099 had never grasped. A massacre wins you a city, mercy wins you a story, and the story is the thing that lasts forever. The Christians who walked out of Jerusalem in 1187 carried that moment with them across Europe. They told it. They repeated it in courts and churches and taverns. Chroniclers on both sides wrote it down. For centuries, in the middle of wars that had drenched the Holy Land in blood on both sides, the one story that every European knew, the one detail that no propagandist could erase or twist or rewrite, was that Saladin had let them live. Not some of them, all of them. He had looked at a city built on the bones of his people, and he had chosen not to repay it in kind. He had looked at 88 years of silence from the dead and decided that the living did not have to answer for them. That choice did not make him less of a conqueror. It made him the most dangerous kind, because it made him impossible to hate completely. And in a war built entirely on hatred, that is the most powerful weapon of all. The story you are watching right now is the proof. 838 years later, and we are still telling it.